sound design fundamentals. Now, this is going to be very simple for a lot of people here because I know I have a big sound design heavy audience. I know a lot of you like to make wubs, you like to make screeches, you like to make drums, you like to make weird things. I do want to talk about this concept of sound design fundamentals. My hope, as I mentioned before, is that this is going to be a multi-part series which goes over the different types of sound design. Right now, we're just going to look at the basic process of sound synthesis using a synthesizer, some sort of digital tool in order to create the sound we want. And then we'll go into the different types of synthesis. Probably next week we'll do a whole thing on subtractive synthesis. The week after we'll do FM. The week after we'll do probably Wavetable. Then we'll do additive, and then we'll do some sort of modular hybrid synthesizer stuff. Then we'll get into manipulating audio, things such as foley and granular synthesis, warping samples, samplers, etc., all of that stuff. But for now, this is going to be like stage one. I'm going to assume if you're watching this video or you're watching the stream right now, you have never made a sound before. You've always used presets inside of a synthesizer, or you've used audio samples, or maybe you've never made anything before and you're just curious. You want to know how it works. Awesome. On a fundamental level, synthesis is the process of taking a sound generator. You're using a filter and you're using an amplifier to create frequencies, sculpt those frequencies, and then shape how those frequencies enter and leave over time. Up here I have our trusty friend phase plant. And phase plant is what we would call a hybrid modular synthesizer, or a hybrid semi-modular synthesizer. If you don't know what those terms mean yet, don't worry about it. It just means this can do multiple types of synthesis, and it is something where you pick the various components yourself. The general process of making a sound involves taking some sort of sound generator, like I said. This is what we would call an oscillator. It takes a repeating waveform and it loops that X number of times a second. If I play, once my keyboard turns on, if I press this note right here, I am pressing a note that will oscillate, rotate back and forth. There we go. That is 440 oscillations a second. It's the note A above the middle C on a piano keyboard. With that being, whoops, what? Yeah, with that being, I believe it's like 260, 255 or something like that. I don't remember the exact number, but it's going to be close to an even multiple of 440. We have different shapes for that oscillation. This is a smooth vibration, essentially back and forth. We could call this a sine wave based on the mathematical concept of a sinusoid, a sinusoidal wave. This thing right here, it's just a mathematical function, which is just a smooth curve between 2 points. There's no rigidness to it. If I were to use a different synthesizer, I'm going to use two synthesizers to show off these waveforms. One's going to be phase plant, the other is going to be called Wavetable. This is a different form of a type of synthesizer called a Wavetable synthesizer. You can see this shape right down here looks very similar to the sine wave right here, but if I click this button right here, notice how it looks like just a perfect circle. Because that's really what is happening. A signal is being sent to your speaker cone that is moving in and out like this, like that straight line. But in physics, in terms of how it emanates out into the air, it's like a circle. It's a wave. It emanates outwards from its origin. So for all of these shapes, try and think about what it would connect with in terms of this top-down view, this ring. The next shape we have is a triangle wave. You can hear, hold on, let me turn this off. You can hear that just by going from this smooth, rounded shape to this more rigid, linear shape, where it just sort of directly goes from the top to the bottom, we start to add more tones to the sound. If I keep this up, and we go back to our sine wave, you can see there's that momentary spike. There's a couple bits of what we would consider noise or artifacts in the signal, but there's just a single pure tone. Now, we're starting to get these additional tones that follow a mathematically consistent ratio, similar like the Fibonacci spiral or whatever. It's whatever your current value is, multiply that by 1. That is the note you're pressing. Multiply that by 2, you get what we would call the first harmonic overtone, or the second harmonic. Then multiply that by 3, by 4, by 5, by 6, etc., etc. Technically, this is not doing that, but don't worry about that right now. We'll get to that in a second. The next thing to look at would be how that appears here. So if we set this to the triangle wave shape, you can see it's generally rounding out, but there's these points right here. So it's fairly smooth, but we do have these points on the circle that are a little bit jagged. So just imagine what that would do to the air. If there's little boop, little peaks and kind of fast motions, it's not smooth. It has a sense of agitation. That's why, on a physical level, at least it's one way to think about why it makes these specific harmonics, because of those little tiny imperfections from this pure circle, right? Looks almost like a heart, like a very rounded heart. If we go to the next shape right here, we see that we have that perfect circle, but notice that it seems to be kind of growing over time, and it starts wider than it does at the beginning. So at some point, to get back to where we started, it has to snap. It has to really quickly pop back in to the position that it started off. Every single time it completes a cycle, it has to go boo up, boo up, boo up, boo up, which I'm making funny noises. I can accept that. Look at it. You can see that. Like, we have this smooth line and then jumps back down. Straight line, jumps back down. Straight line, jumps back down. Now you can see on here, there's a little bit of fuzziness right there. And that's due to the fact that we're talking about the difference between mathematical characteristics and physics. Mathematically speaking, what's trying to happen is you go from a value of 1 to a value of -1. If that's kind of weird, don't worry. We're going to talk a little bit about this idea of waveform amplitude in a little bit, but don't worry about it. maximum, minimum. It's immediately jumping to there. Physically speaking, your speakerphone or your speaker amplifier in your headphones or on your computer speakers or on your phone speakers or on your earbuds or whatever, they can't be in two places at once. It is physically impossible for an object of this scale, of this size, to be in two moments at once. It's not an atom. It's not a quark. It's not a neutron. It's a collection of those things, so it's not subject to that sort of variability. The amount of time that it takes creates that little click. If I play this at a really low octave, this is the lowest C on the piano, you can actually almost start to hear those clicks. Let me pull it down an octave. You hear all of those individual clicks. You can hear every single time that it clicks. Every single time. Exactly. It's literally that pop from the speaker going all the way out, pushing all the way back in, and then returning to its place at rest at the center. Now, watch what happens when I click this button right here. Listen. Now listen. So what's happening here? Notice how this has that smooth line that comes up, jumps down, then smoothly comes back up to meet where it started. Here, there's no longer that smooth line. So there's one of these spaces right here off screen, off where we can visibly see it. You can see there's no line visible, but you can assume that there's another one of those to get it back up to the top half. So this has only one line, this has two. Notice that it sounds like it's getting twice as repetitive. Now, if we go back to Wavetable and we look at the difference between this saw wave and this square wave, I've been avoiding the names for them, but we will kind of go through them in just a second. Look at what's happening on the circle. You have this larger circle up here, then you have a snappy line, smaller half circle, snappy line, larger half circle, snappy line, smaller half circle, snappy line, X number of times. Now, I'm going to go back up to our A up here, and let's listen to these last two sounds at a normal volume or at a normal pitch. So, notice they look very similar up here, but the saw wave has this one, 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 etc., etc., whereas the square wave seems to skip one. Remember, this is 1, this is times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5, times 6, times 7, times 8, times 9. If you do just math, 440 times 2 is 880. This is at 880. 440 times 3 is, I believe, 1320? 1320, 1330 or so. Then 440 times 4, 440 times 5, etc., etc. So why is this not that? Square waves only include the odd ordered harmonics. X times 1, X times 3, X times 5, X times 7, etc., etc., etc. Now, in terms of their timbre, we can now start to divide all of these waveforms up based on their harmonic profile. So we'll go from left to right here. The most harmonically complex sound is a saw wave. If I play a low note down here, you can see there's a lot of waves here. A saw wave, because each one of these looks like the teeth on a saw. This is also known as a pulse or square wave. This has half the number of frequencies as the saw wave. It's called a pulse wave because you could also look at it as a binary on-off pulse, where off is all the way down here, on is all the way up here. And that's literally how they made the first pulse wave, the first saw or square wave, is they just sent on-off messages X number of times a second. And you can also modify how close together those pulses are. As you can see, will affect the harmonics that are present. Then you have the triangle wave, which, if you notice, has the same harmonics as the square wave, but they're much more muted. Watch. Same number, but a much sharper roll-off. And then a sine wave would just have a single pitch. This is, again, a triangle wave. I forgot if I mentioned that. So we have saw, square, triangle, and sine. Those are the fundamental building blocks of every single sound. Technically, period. You can just add a full stop to the end of that. Technically speaking, every single sound in existence can come down to some modification of one of these 4 basic shapes. It's kind of crazy, right? Using just 4 different modes of oscillation, you can get everything. Saw wave, sine wave. Notice, they both start on the same thing. If I grab a filter, which we're about to get into, I make it very tight and I focus it in on that lowest note. Then I go to the next one. Should work. I'm surprised it's not actually isolating out. Oh, because I have the wrong thing. There we go. There we go. I had a sine wave selected, but there's the lowest one. Notice how it's almost like there's a bunch of different pitches there. And then if I go to a sine wave and I play with this, does the same sort of sound, right? So, again, if you're new, don't worry about this. We will cover this again when we circle back to additive synthesis in a few weeks. Every single sound in existence, at its very core, can be made up of individual sine waves, individual single smooth oscillations. This right here, this right here, this right here. If you had an infinite number of sine waves, you could theoretically make every single one of these sounds, but that's a special thing. Don't worry about it. Pretty much every sound can be made from one of these two. If I take a square wave and I apply a filter to it, there's very little tonal difference between these two sounds right now. In effect, in terms of how we perceive the sound, this filtered square wave is the same as this triangle wave. They are perceived to our ears as the same sound because it doesn't matter what the waveform is. What matters is the amplitude and frequency of the different, what we would call partials or harmonics of the sound. So when you are doing synthesis, you take one of these sounds. Typically you start with something that is more harmonically rich. A saw wave or a square wave tends to be the baseline for most sounds. Then you put it through an effect called a filter. That filter, as you see here, will start to sculpt those frequencies. They can remove frequencies or they can boost frequencies. And there's moments where that starts to get very almost human sounding. It feels almost like someone saying wow, 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 wow when I move this up and down. Right? And then after the filtration, there's usually some sort of voltage controlled amplifier. No, it's no longer usually controlled by actual electrical voltage, but in the old days it does. So as a holdover, usually we refer to the amplifier, the thing that takes this frequency information and outputs it to our speakers, as a VCA, a voltage controlled amplifier. With this one, we have control over the total output volume right here. And we can also use what we call an envelope to sculpt the volume curve of the sound. I'm not going to go too deep into these just yet. A lot of this is going to be reiterated next week in subtractive synthesis. I'm just introducing you to these concepts. This is what we usually refer to as an ADSR envelope. This has two additional parameters of delay and hold. Ignore those for now. Ignore those for now. I know it's annoying to have things that you can see, but you can't touch. But you can play with these if you have those features in your synthesizer just to experiment. But basically, this refers to how quickly or how slowly the volume increases to the decibel level you have set here at gain. You have the level in percentage, typically, in relationship to this maximum output volume. The resting point is when you hold the key down. That's going to be affected by this decay parameter, which is how long it takes to go from its maximum point to that sustained level, and then how long it takes after you release the key for the sound to return to silence. So as I have this set up, it will take about 50 milliseconds to go from silence to full volume, which here would be minus 11 decibels. Then it would take 146 milliseconds to drop down to 46% of its total volume. Just for clarity's sake, I'll set it to 50%. So it'll drop half of its total volume, and then the release will be about 100 milliseconds. Is the envelope linked? No. So these are all completely disconnected from each other. None of these things speak to each other other than to say, here is my state at this moment in time. This has no opinion on what this is doing and what this is doing. As you can see, we have these little arrows here. Look at this as the flow of information. We have the frequency information put out by this. It's saying make this shape at, if I play up here, I'm saying 440 times per second, starting from this 0 point. When I press the key down, I can change that with some of the parameters. We're not going to talk about this week. We can talk about that later when we're talking about subtractive synthesis. But when I press this key, it says start here and then move up and go repeat this 440 times a second based on what I'm pressing here. It feeds that data, the information of this shape moving this many times a second. It puts it into this filter, which says take the frequencies up here and remove them. take the frequency right here and boost it. Take the frequency below here and don't do anything to it. Again, this doesn't care about how it's moving over time. It's just saying take the frequency data and affect it this way. That creates a running signal, just some continuous running, what we would call a formant. The actual curve of each of those individual partials would be the formant of the sound. Then that continuous stream of information, it starts off with the volume at silence. The output volume is at silence, even though it's always happening. It's always running. Even right now as I'm talking, technically this is outputting this information to this. This is outputting this information to this. We just don't hear it because the signal needs to receive a trigger, some sort of impulse that would be received when I press a button on my keyboard. Then it's going to signal this amplifier to say, hey, go from not outputting any volume up to this volume at this level. Then pull it down to here. Then once you receive another impulse that says stop running this note, send the volume down back to silence. So there is no interconnectedness there. Now, as I play this, sounds slightly like music. Now, as I increase the attack time to make it more obvious, you can hear that each hit has that same slope. What happens when I press notes at the same time? They sound like they're basically the same thing, but what if I stagger them? The envelope affects every individual note separately. That's because of a specific feature that most modern synthesizers have, which is something called polyphony. Under the hood, what's happening is every time I press more than one note, essentially what's happening is each time I press this note, a copy of this whole processing chain is created. I press one note, one instance of this whole thing is created. I press two notes, I now have two copies of this entire path of processing. I now have two versions of this, two versions of this, two versions of this. They're identical copies of each other, but they are independent from one another. It doesn't matter where the other one is, apart from how they add together going outside of the container, which is the synthesizer. The number of times you can do that will be determined by this thing down here called polyphony. Polyphony will change how many notes you can play at a time. If I have this to 1, you hear what happens? It has a but it kind of feels like it's like a trill or like a melodic device. It feels like the notes kind of moving every time I play it. If I move this up to 2, I'm trying to like roll different notes here. Now we can do you can play these little 2-part counterpoint things, but the second you try and add a third one, we get that same sort of trilly effect. And the more voices of polyphony, the more copies you can have. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is a copy is to reinforce this idea. The higher your polyphony, the more concurrent notes you have per sound. That grows your processing per sound. It's not going to be an exact doubling of processing power because a lot of modern synthesizers are done in a way so that they can manage lots of additional copies by doing some kind of cost-saving math, but it will always have more of an impact. So if you're working with a synthesizer and you find that it's starting to do a lot of resource hogging, one thing you can do to save on CPU is to reduce the polyphony. The number of voices being played at any one time. Now, Elskis had a question about every note or every voice. What Elskis is distinguishing now is the difference between polyphony and what we would call unison. Now, in music theory, unison refers to when two notes are played at the exact same pitch. If I play this note and I sing, my voice and the synthesizer are in unison. Similar to the idea of we're united, we're in unison, we're together, but also in terms of the pitches, we are going to be at about the same thing. My voice, my larynx, my voice box is vibrating at 440 times a second, roughly. It's not going to be exact because I'm human. I can't do exactly 440 hertz of vibrations exactly the same every single time. Neither can any of you. So, if I sing ha and you sing ha, I actually encourage you, if you are comfortable singing out loud, while I'm singing, try singing along with me. And if you're listening on speakers specifically, it'll be a little bit harder if you're on headphones, but if you're listening on speakers, the sound waves from your voice will interact with the sound waves from my voice, and you will hear some subtle movement together in our voices. So that's our reference pitch, okay? I'm going to do it now. You can do it with me, okay? Get in your heads. Ready? Hopefully, if you did it, you heard that motion. If not, don't worry about it, because we're going to mimic the imperfections from the fact that I can't sing at exactly 440, and I guarantee you can't either. Instead, there's going to be subtle differences. And those subtle differences will result in our, yes, you want to match the octave. If you can't sing in that octave, I understand. You can try this on your own if you have speakers with a synthesizer or a recording. But yeah, the idea is you want to be at the same pitch. Even, not pitch class, because in music theory, there's a difference between pitch class, which is the note C regardless of octave. And then there is pitch, which is note and octave combined. But that sort of choir effect where the sum of what we're doing rounds out to that thing. How's it going, Kev? Computers can do that by this thing called Unison, which in synthesizers refers to taking the oscillator, not anything after it, okay? It doesn't affect these two things. Neither of these are affected by this. And this gets to your question. As far as I can tell, Elskis, neither of these are split per voice of unison, just per note played. But I think Polyphonic does. I don't quote me on that. Double check the faceplant manual. It might only affect the note. So what's happening here is instead of one oscillator every time I press a key on my keyboard, it takes that oscillator of 440 cycles a second and it copies it twice. It says we're going to tune one copy 25 cents sharp of where we're at. So if this one's at 440 hertz a second, this one might be at 445 or 448 or 450 or 442. It'll be just slightly off, just barely off. And then there's a second oscillator that is going minus 25 cents or minus 25 cents, which would be like 438 or 432 or 430 cycles per second. Our ears are going to not only calculate that with this one at 440, this one at 440 or 440, 442, and 438, if you add 42 and 38 together, average them out, you're going to get about 440. Our ears can do that math and kind of round them all together into one thing, but we'll still hear that combination, which is usually perceived as an additional vibration based on the difference in frequencies. So if we are talking about something at 438 and something at 442, that's a difference of 4 hertz, of 4 cycles per second. So our ears would hear essentially a pulse of approximately 4 kind of volume pulses per second. Based on the octave, the different frequencies are going to change. If you're doing based on what we would call cents, which is the relative value per octave, versus hertz, which is the strict value per octave. And it creates this sort of effect. So on its own, I'll even turn this off a little bit. Let me just turn this off all the way. Now watch. All of a sudden, we have this and if you count it out, each one of those, this is just those 2 copies, the one that are equal and opposite to each other. So if this is at, so this is 1 octave below middle C, so this is at 220 cycles a second. I don't know the exact hertz value of those, but that pulse will add up to the difference between the 2 oscillators playing this one exact note. As I go up, it kind of smooths that out because there's more frequent or more sounds that are kind of separate, until you get this nice washed out sound. Typically, in order to avoid a lot of that kind of phase cancellation, which we'll talk about next week, don't worry, which is just that pulsing. Don't worry about what that means. We'll talk about that next week. And it just kind of hides it in the background. But if you go up too high, it kind of feels weird. So as a way to make it feel more natural, you don't have a choir of 7 people standing all in a line. You have them spread out. So now each individual voice in this virtual choir has its own space in the stereo image to work together, and that creates this wonderful wide sound, which is very classic kind of EDM-y sounds. Yes, spread is pan just per individual voice, which is to say at 0% spread, everything is panned directly to the middle. As you increase the pan, each voice is getting spread out equally so that they are relative. Yeah, it's going to be relative to the main voice, which is if you have an odd number, the main voice, voice number 1 is always going to be in the center. If you have an even number, they will be equally divided. There will not be a centered one. So that's actually something to keep in mind. If you want your sound to feel more centered when using Unison, use an odd number of Unison voices. If you want a sound to feel more to the side, use an even number of Unison voices. I found that the JP106 Super Saw chorus effect is generally it was good for long enough for it to become the standard, so why go above it? Typically 7 is my amount. Sometimes I'll go to 2 or 3 if I'm trying to do like a Reese-based sound, but 7 was good enough for Roland. 7's good enough for me. Plus, if I just want it to be more wide, I just do 6 or 8. Beyond this process, the different types of synthesis are going to vary how this whole thing works. I've technically introduced you to subtractive synthesis, but we're going to go over each of these in much more detail next week. So don't worry if it feels like I glossed over a lot of stuff. This is all an attempt to introduce you to just the fundamentals. These are just the building blocks of making everything else. Everything else utilizes these 3 basic tools to modify themselves, and sometimes it takes recordings of these changes and puts them into it. Think of this kind of like you would a college course, where in the first week you're just getting thrown dictionary terms that you don't need to necessarily memorize. I'm not expecting you to memorize everything we talked about with Unison. We're going to go over that again. I'm not going to expect you to memorize everything about zero crossing, which we'll touch on briefly here, but go more in depth with next week on subtractive synthesis. The only thing I want to talk about on a conceptual level would be this idea of once you've gotten the sound, what you want to do is then add other tools, these different effects, in order to process the sound, which makes it feel a lot more expressive, like a human being is playing them. Feels really nice. Feels more whole. I'm not going to tell you what I did here. I'm not going to tell you too much about these. These will come when we talk about post-processing a sound. That'll be kind of how we lead from the different types of synthesis into utilizing real-world sounds and recorded audio or manipulation of audio files and audio data for sound design. But this is generally the way it works. That is what I would consider the fundamentals. That's really all you need to know to get started exploring. If you've never done anything with synthesis before, I recommend you find a synthesizer, ideally something that is built into your DAW. As you can see, I'm in Ableton Live. We have Wavetable, which looks like this, Tension, which looks like this, Simpler, which is not a synthesizer, Sampler, not a synthesizer, Operator, good option, Impulse, Instrument Rack is just a container. Impulse is another sampler. Don't worry about these. We'll talk about these in a little bit. External Instrument just connects you to other things. Electric is another synthesizer. Collision and Analog are both synthesizers of various types. You can play around with one of those. And then Drum Rack is basically just another container for a bunch of samples. I would recommend if you're in Ableton using something like Wavetable, Operator, or Analog. Those will be really good introductions. I would say if you're going to plan ahead for the next few weeks, I would say if you want to get ready for next week, play around with something like Analog in FL Studio. This would be something like 3X Oscillator, 3X Osc. When we're getting ready to do frequency modulation or FM synthesis, Operator or Citrus would be your go-to. We get into wavetable synthesis, that would be obviously Wavetable and Ableton. I don't know if there's a dedicated wavetable synthesizer in FL Studio, but there is Serum, there is also Phase Plant, and there are other wavetable synthesizers on the market. And then for additive synthesis, we're either going to dip into probably Razor for me, and then I might show off Harmor. Yeah, and there are plenty of free synthesizers. If you don't have any of these synthesizers, there are plenty of free options. For next week, if you don't have Ableton or FL, if you don't want to use any of their free ones, there are plenty of free subtractive synthesizers by companies like Yuhi. Someone, as Elskis said, there's Tyrell, there's also Podolsky, which is a really nice free subtractive synthesizer. This is a subtractive synth. It's a great one to play around with. It's free. There is also Helm, which is a free subtractive synthesizer. And then there is Surge, which is another free subtractive synthesizer. So there are plenty of free options out there. They're going to be way more aggressive than what you would expect in terms of their UI. They might be a bit overwhelming, but we will hopefully break that down for you. With FM synthesis, you can use something like Dext. Dext is a good free FM synthesizer. I'm sure there are others out there. In terms of wavetable synthesis, we will be using probably, if not Wavetable, Yuhi's Zebralet, which is a free single voice wavetable synthesizer. And we will be working through that as well. Just to introduce you to the concepts, you don't need to pay any money beyond the investment for your DAW to use these tutorials.